As a modern-Orthodox Jew, I have a little bit of a hard time with Hanukkah. I believe profoundly in the idea of getting ideas from the non-Jewish world, embracing wisdom wherever it comes from. I've studied science, I've studied philosophy, I continue to. So when I think about Hanukkah, when I think about what the struggle of the Hashmonaim was, what the Maccabim fought for, it makes me feel a little bit unsure about exactly where I would have fit in. Right? The story I heard when I was a kid, the story we hear about is a battle for the purity of Torah, a battle against the secular, non-Jewish influences that were encroaching upon the values of Torah. And the question is, are we as modern Orthodox Jews who embrace the outside world as well, are we able, without being hypocrites, to celebrate Hanukkah in an authentic way? This isn't a question that I alone struggled with. It's a question that Rav Kook and many other of the great Gedolim throughout the generation struggled with. Rav Kook, Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Hirsch, the Rambam, most of the Rishonim in the Middle Ages, they were very involved in integrating and understanding the values that came from the secular world and bringing many of them into the tents of Torah. And the question that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about is how we as Jews who are devoted to Torah, who believe in the Kedusha and the emes of Torah, and celebrate that, the purity of Torah on Hanukkah, how we also at the same time relate to the secular values of the outside world. Rav Kook discusses this question in a fascinating piece in his Ein Hayah, his commentary on Masechet Shabbat, and he does it in a way where he sort of takes some of the halachic discussions that show up in Masechet Shabbat about Ner Hanukkah, and he uses them as symbols for this question about exactly how we're supposed to relate to values from the non-Jewish world. He's discussing the Gemara that talks about the oils and the wicks that are used for the Ner Hanukkah. And the Gemara says, in its conclusion, that the oils and the wicks that we use for Ner Hanukkah do not need to be as high quality as the oil and the wick that's used for a Ner Shabbat. Even on Shabbat, even if you're lighting a Chanukiah that's going to be burning on Shabbat, nonetheless, you can use a subpar, a lower standard oil and a lower standard wick to light the Ner Hanukkah, and the reason given is twofold. Number one, the Gemara says, this is Rav, the Amora Rav, he says, number one, the halacha is kavta ein zakukla. That if the light of the Ner Hanukkah goes out, if you lit it in a proper way, but for some reason a hurricane comes along and blows out the fire, you have no obligation to relight the fire. That's number one. Number two is that asur lishtamesh la'ora. The halacha is you're not allowed to benefit from the light of the Chanukiah. Right? If you want to learn Torah and the room is pitch black, you can't sit by the Ner Hanukkah and learn Torah. That's why we have a shamash, right? So that if we ever do by accident benefit from the light, it's really the light of the shamash. Okay, so Rav Kook wants to understand, number one, why would it be that if the light of the Ner Hanukkah goes out, why would it be you have no obligation to light it again? Number two, why is it that you're not allowed to use that light for practical purposes? And number three, why would it be that you're allowed to use subpar, substandard oils and substandard wicks for the Ner Hanukkah, but not for Ner Shabbat? So he says like this. He says that the light of Torah derives from its pure source, from what he calls Shemen HaTahor, from the highest levels of Shemen. And there's a kind of Torah, there's a kind of connection to Ratzon Hashem that is totally pure, that has no interaction whatsoever with anything beyond the realm of Torah itself. That's what he calls Shemen HaTahor. And he describes, in addition, the wick. What's the wick? The wick is the goof. The wick is the body that draws the Shemen up and enables it to become a flame. What a Jewish life is about is really that interaction between the Shemen and the wick, right? Between the oil, the Torah, and the person, the body of the person himself that embodies that Torah and brings it into the world in an active way. The combination of those two things, the wick without the oil without the wick, wouldn't really be anything. The flame of a person who lives a life of Torah, Torat Chaim, is when those two things come together in a proper way. That's the idea of what he calls Torah Nitzchit. Torah that lasts forever, that never changes, that is exactly as Hashem intended it when He gave it to the world. However, he talks about another kind of Torah, which he views as just as crucial, especially when Am Yisrael is in Galut. When Am Yisrael is in Galut, he says, and we can all relate to this, that whenever you're a minority, surrounded by a very powerful majority, by definition, it's human psychology that we are attracted to the values of the outside world. It's not something that you can avoid. You can try to shelter yourself, but every single person is exposed to the surrounding culture. And by definition, once we're aware of the way that the surrounding culture thinks, we're going to be attracted to that way of thinking. I'll give you an example. Probably anyone I'm speaking to right now is at least somewhat conscious of their bodily shape, right? In other words, how heavy or thin they are, whether their muscles are large or small. We're aware of that. We think about that. That's a uniquely American 20th and 21st century way of thinking. There were many, many generations, in the non-Jewish world, not just the Jewish world, where people didn't really care how big their muscles were. That wasn't on the radar screen of most individuals. Right? Part of our consciousness of ourselves is shaped by the world we're around. Whether we try to be aware of that or not, it's just part of what it means to be immersed in that culture. I'll give you another example. Most of us probably have leanings towards appreciating democracy. Right? Democracy itself doesn't have clear roots in Torah. Nonetheless, I would wager that most American Jews, even those who feel themselves very loyal to Torah, definitely identify with a lot of democratic values, supporting minority rights, protecting people from oppression, due process, all the things that come about in the secular democratic society of America. Many of us identify with these things in a very powerful way. Right? So all of us are impacted by the ideas of the majority. Rav Kook says as follows. God, when He sent Am Yisrael to Galut, knew that psychological reality, being attracted to majority values, is what was going to happen. That's by nature what it means to be in Galut. And for that reason, when He wrote the Torah, when He gave the Torah to Har Sinai, He included within the Torah facets that would resonate with the values of the outside world throughout the generations. That means that when God gave the Torah, He already knew what kinds of values, what kinds of emphases and focuses different societies would have throughout the generations, and He encoded within the Torah the potential to discover those same values within it. And therefore, when Am Yisrael is exiled and sent into Galut, and we're struggling to find meaning as Jews, as a minority, surrounded by a majority of the non-Jewish culture, we would be able to find within the Torah what he calls a Torah l'sha'ah. A Torah that's not nitzchi, that's not eternal, it's not totally, existent in itself, apart from societal values, but rather a Torah that's revealed through our interaction with the outside world. In some ways, there are facets of the Torah, he claims, that can only be revealed because we live in a certain society. Right? Whether it's a democratic society or whether a hedonistic society, whatever it is, there's certain things that can only come out because we are, let's say, American Jews. American Jews read the Torah in a unique way because of the society that we come from. So on the one hand, this is not Torah nitzchit. This is not Shemen HaTahor. It's not the pure Torah that God originally intended the world to have. At the same time, it's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's something that's crucial. And he says that it's the responsibility of every chacham, every leader of the generation, to try to develop. When he looks at Rav Hirsch, and he looks at the Rambam, right? The Rambam was, a lot of his writing, a lot of his thinking about Torah was influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. Now these days, Aristotelian philosophy is in the garbage dumps of history. Right? Who learns Aristotle anymore, except for historians, right? We don't think Aristotelian philosophy anymore. Nonetheless, at the time, if the Rambam had not developed a philosophy of Yadus that integrated the facets of Torah that Aristotle could uncover, then the entire Jewish world would have been lost. Whereas the onslaught of just peer pressure, of societal pressure to think like Aristotle was so powerful. If the Rambam hadn't uncovered those facets of Torah, then at that time, Am Yisrael would have been lost. So what Kook is saying is that Chanukah, which is in many ways a reflection of the way that we relate to Torah, we relate to Hashem when we're under attack, when we're oppressed by the nations around us, when we're drawn by the values of the nation around us, Hanukkah reflects the value not of Torah nitzchit, but rather of Torah l'sha'ah, the ability to find light, to create a flame, not of the shemen tahor, but rather of the shemen that's substandard, that's not exactly the ideal Torah that God originally intended. And that's why kavta eino zakuk la, that once the fire goes out, there's no value whatsoever to relighting it again. That the same way that once Aristotelian philosophy, went into the dustbin of history, there's no value for a Jew to become an Aristotelian today, even though the Rambam himself was, right? Because that generation, that particular revelation of Torah has ended, and it's now time for a new facet of Torah to be brought to the world. Once that flame has gone out, we don't go back to relight it. We can study it, we can appreciate it, we can understand it, but the focus of Chachamim in our generation is to bring out the light of Torah that our generation, the society that we're part of, brings out. In addition, this explains why asur lishtamesh la'orah. Rav Kook says that there's one crucial line that has to be drawn. That even while a person is developing this idea of Torah l'sha'ah, this idea of the facets of Torah that the surrounding culture's values can bring out, a person has to be incredibly careful not to bring that into the world of ma'aseh, not to change the way that we observe halacha based on this new understanding. So I'll give you an example based on the Rambam. The Rambam said very famously that Hilchot Kashrut have to do with health, right? From his scientific understanding, kosher food was far healthier than non-kosher food. The Reform movement came along, much later on and said, well, if that's the case, we can eat healthy while eating shrimp, while eating pork. And they chucked halacha into the garbage. So Rav Kook is saying very clearly that the light of Hanukkah is a light that should be seen, it should inspire. It can't be used lamaaseh. It can't be used in terms of the way we actually live our lives as Jews. There are a lot of examples bisman hazeh, but I'll give you an example. Many Jews are environmentally conscious, right? It's certainly a value, certainly a consciousness that the outside world has right now. Save the whales, prevent the ozone layer from being depleted, whatever it is that a Torah value? So a person could very easily, in our generation, look in the Torah and find very clear passages or facets that emphasize these values as well. And it would be very much in keeping with Rav Kook's idea of Torah l'sha'ah for a person to create a very strong emphasis in our generation on those values, because what it's doing is it's enabling Jews who are drawn after outside values to find those very same values embedded within the Torah itself. And that is a genuine, authentic Torah flame. It may not last forever. It could be that at some point along the way, the world will forget about the environment for whatever reason, right? At that point, there'll no longer be a flame of Torah that has to be burning. It may or may not, but it won't be a loss if that flame goes out, because there'll be a new flame to light as well. Finally, one last point before we end. Rav Kook explains that this is also the difference between the Chashmonaim and Beit David. It's very strange. Chazal have a very ambivalent relationship with the Chashmonaim. On the one hand, they're heroes. On the other hand, Chazal refuse to include them in Tanakh. Chazal don't even dedicate a particular Masechet to talk about Hanukkah, because the Chashmonaim, they overstepped their bounds. They became kings when the kingship, the Malchus, is only set aside for Beit David. So what Rav Kook says is, once again, that the Chashmonaim were meant to serve a particular role as a very temporary form of Malchus. That Beit David is a Malchus that reflects the values of Torah. Beit Chashmonaim is meant to be a very temporary national solution to crisis, but even from the very beginning never had a chance to survive in a full way and never fully reflected the values of the Torah. For that reason, the Chazal have a very ambivalent relationship with it, but nonetheless, we celebrate it, because Am Yisrael wouldn't have survived and wouldn't have thrived if it hadn't been for what the Chashmonaim brought to the world. So it's a kind of complex idea that Rav Kook is bringing to us, and it's meant to sort of get us to think a little bit about where we draw our lines in terms of the way we relate to the outside world, to the values we bring into our thinking about Torah and about ourselves. I guess one thought that I can leave you with is to ask yourself, when you're drawn after ideas that you read about, you hear about in college, read in the newspaper, Rav Kook seems to have no problem with that. The question, I think the cheshbon nefesh we can all have on Hanukkah, is when I take an idea that I get from the outside world, do I use it to uncover a facet of Torah? Do I then ask myself and struggle with the question, how is this going to reveal a facet of Ratzon Hashem and a facet of Torah that's meant to be discovered in this generation? That's the mission that today's Jewish leaders have, to uncover the relevance and the light of Torah that can be uncovered while we're encountering the outside world. And Yehi Ratzon, we should all be successful in uncovering that light of
Israel,